There is a moment that feels almost invisible at first, a shift so quiet that even the person experiencing it doesn't immediately understand what just began. And that moment is the value blackout, the phase where the favors stop, the comfort disappears, the access quietly closes, and what once felt endlessly available becomes unreachable. But to the avoidant mind, it does not register as loss right away. It registers as relief, as breathing room, as finally having space again. And for a short while, it even feels empowering, like a return to control, like regaining emotional territory that once felt crowded. Yet beneath that sense of independence, something unfamiliar begins to echo. A subtle hollowness, a silence that is not peaceful but unsettling, because the blackout is not loud. It does not announce itself with arguments or dramatic exits. It begins with the absence of small things, the missing check ins, the lack of gentle concern, the vanishing emotional availability that used to exist without being requested, and the avoidant does what they have always done best. They intellectualize it. They tell themselves nothing changed. They convince themselves this is normal, this is healthy, this is how it should be. But late at night, when distractions fade and the mind becomes louder than the world, they feel it. A strange emptiness that doesn't have a clear name yet. A discomfort they cannot blame on anyone else. And this is where the intro of regret quietly plants its first seed, not as pain, but as confusion. Not as heartbreak, but as an undefined sense that something familiar has gone missing and cannot be easily replaced. And viewers watching this can feel the emotional distance forming like a fog, because the blackout is not punishment, it is not revenge, it is simply the withdrawal of value that once flowed naturally. And the avoidant realizes too late that the absence of warmth feels colder than expected. In the beginning of this blackout, the ego steps in like a loyal bodyguard, protecting pride at all costs, whispering reassuring thoughts that say nothing important was lost, that dependence was never real, that all those small gestures were unnecessary anyway. And the avoidant repeats these thoughts like affirmations, convincing themselves they never truly needed the emotional rides, the late night listening, the silent understanding that once filled their days. But daily life has a strange way of exposing truth through inconvenience, because the moments that once felt effortless now require effort. The tasks that once felt light now feel heavier, and the emotional load that someone else quietly carried becomes visible only when it is no longer being carried at all. And this is where viewers begin to feel the subtle ache beneath the surface, because the avoidant is not cruel, not heartless, just deeply conditioned to survive by minimizing need. Yet the blackout slowly removes the illusion of total independence, showing them how often they leaned without admitting it, how often support arrived before they even asked, and the pride that once felt protective starts feeling isolating. But instead of admitting discomfort, they double down on detachment. They appear calm, collected, unbothered, while internally they start noticing the growing list of things that used to be easier when someone quietly cared. And that internal contradiction becomes emotionally gripping for the audience, because it reveals the silent war between ego and emotional truth. The war where the avoidant keeps telling themselves they are fine while their daily experiences keep proving otherwise. Then the small comforts begin to haunt them, not the grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, but the tiny consistent acts that once felt ordinary, the simple "are you okay" messages, the gentle reminders, the emotional availability that never demanded attention yet always existed. And this is where the value blackout becomes personal, because it is not the loss of a person that hurts first. It is the loss of familiarity, the disappearance of warmth woven into routine, the missing presence that once softened difficult days without making a scene. And viewers can feel this deeply, because everyone understands the weight of small kindnesses once they are gone. And for the avoidant, this realization is disorienting. They do not openly grieve these comforts. They do not confess missing them. Instead, they feel an unexplained restlessness, a sense that something is slightly off in their emotional environment, and they begin searching for distractions, work, entertainment, conversations that fill time, but not the specific emotional space that used to be filled effortlessly. And this creates a powerful emotional pull for the viewer because the avoidant is not chasing the person, they are chasing the feeling they never acknowledge needing. And the more they try to ignore it, the more noticeable its absence becomes. Like a quiet room where a familiar sound suddenly stops and the silence becomes louder than the noise ever was. As the blackout continues, their behavior shifts in subtle ways. They barely notice themselves. They open their phone without intention, scrolling through old messages, revisiting digital spaces, not to reach out, but to feel proximity without vulnerability, to experience closeness without risk. And this is where emotional tension rises because they are not ready to speak, not ready to admit, not ready to expose their need. Yet their actions reveal longing disguised as curiosity. And viewers recognize this pattern instantly. The quiet checking, the passive observation, the invisible thread that still exists even when communication stops. And inside the avoidant, a silent dialogue begins, a back and forth between pride and desire, between the urge to reconnect and the fear of losing control. And every scroll becomes a reminder that access once existed without effort, that connection once flowed without negotiation, and now even the smallest interaction feels like a risk, which intensifies the emotional weight of the blackout because it transforms familiarity into distance and ease into hesitation, and the audience feels the irony, the painful realization that the avoidant wanted space but did not anticipate the emotional cost of that space becoming permanent. Eventually, pride starts whispering louder, insisting that independence equals strength, repeating the familiar narrative that being alone is safer, cleaner, less complicated. But reality does not argue loudly. It answers quietly through long nights, through thoughts that echo without interruption, through the uncomfortable awareness that silence is no longer peaceful, but heavy. And this is the turning point where regret begins to take shape, not as dramatic sorrow, but as subtle fatigue, irritability, without clear cause, emotional tiredness that cannot be blamed on external events, and viewers connect deeply here. Because the transformation is internal and painfully human, the avoidant is not collapsing, not begging, not chasing. They are simply feeling the emotional consequences of emotional distance. And that subtle suffering is more powerful than visible heartbreak because it shows that regret does not always scream. Sometimes it sighs, sometimes it appears as boredom, sometimes as frustration, sometimes as the quiet realization that independence without emotional connection feels incomplete. And in this stage, the blackout is no longer invisible. It becomes undeniable, yet still unspoken, and the viewer is left emotionally attached to the unfolding awareness, watching the avoidant slowly understand that losing access to warmth, comfort, and effortless care was not freedom. It was the beginning of an emotional echo they can no longer silence. And as this emotional echo continues to expand inside them, the nervous system begins reacting before the mind is willing to admit anything because the body remembers safety even when the ego denies it ever existed. And this is where the value blackout transforms from a quiet inconvenience into a subtle emotional withdrawal that they cannot logically explain. Their sleep becomes lighter, their patience shorter, their tolerance for noise lower, not because life suddenly became difficult, but because the emotional anchor they once dismissed is no longer present to stabilize them. And viewers can feel the intensity of this shift because it is not visible to the outside world. It is deeply internal, a silent imbalance that shows up in moods and reactions, in the way they sigh more often or feel drained without understanding why. And instead of recognizing this as emotional loss, they label it stress, exhaustion, bad timing, anything except the truth that comfort once existed and now it does not. And this avoidance of acknowledgement creates a powerful emotional tension for the audience because they witness the gap between what the avoidant feels and what they are willing to admit. And that gap widens with each passing day of the blackout, turning what once felt like independence into a state of subtle emotional hunger they do not have the vocabulary to describe. Soon, irritation begins to replace calmness, and it surprises them because nothing dramatic happened. No conflict, no betrayal, No loud ending, just absence. Yet, the absence starts provoking reactions they cannot control. They become less tolerant of minor inconveniences, more easily frustrated by delays, more emotionally reactive to small disappointments. And this emotional friction confuses them because they believed distance would bring peace. But instead, it brings agitation, and viewers watching this unfold feel the emotional contradiction deeply because the avoidant expected silence to be soothing. But silence without emotional warmth becomes an amplifier for inner noise, and that noise grows louder in moments when they are alone, when distractions fade and the truth begins to surface in uncomfortable flashes. And still, they resist labeling it regret. They call it boredom. They call it routine fatigue. They call it anything that protects their pride, but their emotional landscape is shifting in ways they cannot control, and the blackout becomes a mirror reflecting needs they spent years convincing themselves they did not have. Then comes the private romanticizing of the past, a stage so quiet and hidden that no one around them would ever suspect it exists, because publicly they continue to appear detached, composed, even indifferent, but internally their mind starts revisiting old moments with a softness they never allowed themselves to feel in real time. They replace simple interactions, shared laughter, small gestures, ordinary days that once seemed insignificant, and suddenly those memories carry weight, and viewers connect strongly here, because this is where emotional truth begins to bloom behind emotional walls. The avoidant is not reaching out, not confessing, not breaking character, but their internal world becomes filled with nostalgia. They cannot silence, and the irony intensifies because they once minimized those very moments. They once labeled them unnecessary or excessive. Yet now those memories glow with a warmth that contrasts sharply against their present emotional coldness. And this contrast creates a deep emotional pull for the audience, a realization that value is often recognized only when it is no longer accessible. And the blackout becomes less about losing a person and more about losing a feeling of ease they never fully appreciate. As daily life continues, inconveniences begin transforming into emotional reminders, not loud reminders, but subtle nudges that follow them throughout their routine. The empty passenger seat that once felt occupied, the unanswered question they once asked out of habit, the missing emotional reassurance they never verbally requested but always received. And each small inconvenience carries an emotional undertone, a whisper that says something once made this easier, something once softened this experience, and viewers feel this accumulation of reminders like emotional raindrops slowly filling a glass. Because the avoidant does not cry, does not openly mourn, but their environment becomes filled with quiet evidence of what is no longer there. And this stage is emotionally powerful because it highlights how value is woven into ordinary life, not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through presence, through emotional availability that never demanded recognition. And now that it is gone, the avoidant begins to understand its weight, yet still refuses to articulate it, choosing instead to endure the growing awareness in silence, which deepens the emotional resonance for the audience who can clearly see what the avoidant is still trying to avoid seeing. Eventually, language begins to shift, and this is where viewers notice one of the most telling emotional signs, because the avoidant will rarely say, I miss it or I miss them. Instead, their words become generalized, distant, and disguised. They start making broad statements about people being unreliable, about the world being disappointing, about connections never lasting. And these statements act as emotional shields, protecting them from vulnerability while simultaneously revealing hidden longing. And the audience feels the emotional weight of this contradiction because it shows how regret does not always speak directly. Sometimes it hides behind philosophy. Sometimes it disguises itself as cynicism. Sometimes it appears as detached commentary about life rather than honest admission of personal loss. And this stage is deeply compelling because it demonstrates the avoidance internal struggle between emotional truth and emotional defense, a struggle where their heart begins to whisper what their mouth refuses to say, and the blackout reaches a critical emotional depth here. Because the absence of favors, comfort, and access is no longer just an external condition, it has become an internal realization, an understanding, forming quietly that something meaningful slipped away, not through conflict, but through emotional distance. And viewers become fully emotionally attached at this point because they are witnessing the slow emergence of regret in its most human form, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply real, unfolding one quiet thought at a time. And as these disguised words continue to leave their mouth, another realization begins forming beneath the surface, one that feels heavier than all the previous ones combined. Because the blackout does not only remove comfort, it exposes invisible effort. It reveals how much emotional labor once existed quietly in the background, things that were never announced, never requested praise, never demanded acknowledgement, and this awareness does not arrive with gratitude at first. It arrives with discomfort because recognizing unseen effort means confronting the truth that appreciation was missing, and viewers feel this moment like a slow, emotional tightening in the chest because the avoidant begins remembering situations where patience was offered without limit, where understanding was extended without conditions, where emotional steadiness was present even when they themselves were distant. And now those memories do not feel neutral anymore. They carry a subtle weight of guilt mixed with longing, not overwhelming guilt, but enough to shift their perception, enough to make them realize that what they labeled as normal was actually rare. And this realization does not make them run back immediately. Instead, it makes them quieter, more introspective, more emotionally aware in private, while still appearing composed in public. And this duality creates a powerful emotional hook for the viewer because they witness growth happening silently, without applause, without announcement, just a slow awakening that begins reshaping how the avoidant sees the past. With this awareness comes an unexpected transformation in how independence feels, because the same independence that once felt empowering now begins to feel slightly hollow, not unbearable, not dramatic, just incomplete, like a room with perfect structure but missing warmth. And the subtle emotional shift is profound because it challenges a belief they held for years, the belief that needing no one equals strength. And viewers connect deeply here because they recognize the universal truth hidden within this moment. That independence without emotional connection can quietly transform into isolation, and the avoidant begins experiencing this realization in fleeting flashes. Moments where achievements feel less satisfying, where good news feels quieter because there is no emotional mirror reflecting it back, and they do not immediately interpret this as loneliness. They call it routine, they call it normal adult life. Yet internally, a quiet question begins forming, a question they never allowed themselves to ask before, and that question carries emotional gravity because it does not accuse anyone else. It simply asks whether emotional distance truly protected them or slowly disconnected them from something meaningful. And this silent questioning draws viewers in even more because it shows vulnerability, emerging not through confession, but through reflection. Soon the mind begins replaying old conversations with a different emotional lens, and this stage is subtle yet incredibly powerful because memories that once felt neutral now carry emotional nuance. Pauses that once felt awkward now feel tender. Jokes that once felt ordinary now feel warm, and the avoidant starts noticing emotional depth they previously overlooked, not because the past changed, but because their perception did. And viewers feel this shift as an emotional awakening, a realization that understanding often arrives too late. And during these mental replays, they are not trying to reconnect, not drafting messages, not planning returns. They are simply observing their own past reactions with new awareness, noticing moments where vulnerability was offered and gently sidestepped, where closeness was available and quietly avoided. And this self-observation is emotionally gripping because it is honest yet private, a silent accountability that does not require external confrontation. And the blackout intensifies here because it removes distraction, leaving them alone with their own emotional history. And the audience becomes fully immersed in this internal journey, recognizing the courage it takes to see oneself clearly, even when no one else is watching. As days pass, another layer of realization unfolds. One centered around control, because the blackout did something unexpected. It removed their ability to access emotional comfort on demand, and for someone accustomed to emotional distance as a form of control, this shift feels destabilizing, not terrifying, but deeply unfamiliar, and viewers feel the emotional tension rise here because control was never about dominance. It was about safety, about knowing that connection could be approached or withdrawn at will. And now that certainty is gone, replaced by unpredictability, by the understanding that the door they once assumed would always be open is no longer theirs to open. And this realization humbles them quietly, not through humiliation, but through awareness. And that awareness reshapes their emotional posture, making them more cautious, more reflective, more aware of how access itself was a privilege rather than a guarantee. And this moment resonates strongly with viewers because it reveals a universal truth that emotional access is often valued only when it is no longer freely available. And the avoidant begins to understand that connection is not something to control, but something to nurture, even if they are not yet ready to act on that understanding. Then comes one of the most emotionally piercing stages of the blackout, the realization that what once existed is not easily replaced, because they begin encountering new interactions, new conversations, new energies, and while nothing is necessarily wrong with these new experiences, they lack a certain depth, a certain familiarity, a certain emotional patience that once existed naturally. And this comparison does not happen loudly, it happens quietly in the mind, a subtle measuring of emotional resonance. And viewers feel the bittersweet weight of this stage because it shows regret taking clearer shape, not as desperation, but as recognition, the understanding that emotional compatibility is not common, that patience is not guaranteed, that warmth is not universal, and the avoidant starts noticing how rare it is to feel fully understood without explanation, how uncommon it is to be emotionally accepted without performance, and this awareness does not immediately lead to action. Instead, it deepens their introspection, making them more emotionally present within themselves, even if they remain silent externally. And the blackout reaches a profound emotional depth here because it transforms from absence into clarity, from silence into understanding, and viewers become emotionally attached not because of dramatic gestures, but because they witness the slow unfolding of truth, the quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful was lost, not through conflict, but through fear of needing it. And that realization lingers like a soft echo, preparing the emotional ground for what comes next. And after this quiet clarity settles in, behavior begins to shift in ways so subtle that even they struggle to notice it at first. Because regret in an avoidant heart rarely arrives with dramatic gestures. It moves through indirect pathways, through tiny digital footprints and silent observations. And this is where they start testing the emotional waters without admitting they are doing so. A brief pause on a familiar profile, a story viewed without interaction, a post liked and then quickly unliked, not because they want attention, but because they want reassurance without exposure. And viewers feel the delicate tension of this stage because it captures the vulnerability they are trying so hard to hide. The quiet hope that the emotional door might still exist, even if they are not ready to walk through it. And this indirect contact is not manipulation, it is emotional caution, a way of checking whether warmth still lives somewhere without risking rejection. And each small action carries emotional weight far heavier than it appears on the surface. Because behind every glance is a question they cannot tame out loud. A question asking whether connection is still possible, whether forgiveness exists, whether time has completely erased what once felt safe, and the audience becomes deeply attached here because they witness the fragile balance between pride and longing, between fear and hope, a balance that feels profoundly human and painfully relatable. As these quiet checks continue, another realization unfolds, one that is less about the other person and more about themselves, because the blackout begins teaching a lesson they never intentionally signed up to learn. The difference between choosing solitude and experiencing emotional abandonment caused by their own avoidance. And this distinction is emotionally powerful because it removes the comfort of blame. It shifts responsibility inward, and viewers feel the weight of this awareness like a slow emotional sunrise, not harsh, not accusatory, but illuminating, because the avoidant begins to see that being alone is not the same as pushing away connection, that independence loses its strength when it becomes a wall instead of a boundary, and this realization does not crush them. It humbles them, softens their inner narrative, and introduces a gentleness toward their own emotional patterns that never existed before. And this gentleness is what makes the audience lean in emotionally, because growth is happening not through punishment, but through understanding, not through shame, but through awareness. And the blackout evolves from a state of loss into a mirror reflecting personal responsibility, showing them that emotional distance once felt protective, but also quietly limited the depth of their experiences. And this insight becomes a turning point, a silent emotional pivot where they begin seeing themselves with more warmth than ever before. Yet, even with this awareness, silence remains their shield, and the silence becomes both protection and prison. Because while it guards them from the fear of rejection, it also locks away the possibility of reconnection. And viewers feel the emotional tension intensify here because they can sense the internal conflict growing stronger. The desire to reach out colliding with the fear of vulnerability, and this stage is deeply moving because it shows how emotional walls are not built from cruelty, but from past wounds, from learned patterns, from survival instincts that once made sense, and now those same walls feel restrictive, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well, isolating them from the very warmth they secretly crave. And every day of continued silence feels heavier than the last, not dramatic, not unbearable, just increasingly noticeable, like carrying a weight that grows slowly rather than suddenly. And this emotional weight resonates strongly with viewers because it reflects a universal struggle. The fear of opening up after realizing what was lost, the hesitation that lingers even when the heart begins whispering truths, the mind once silent. Then comes the hardest realization of all, the one that pierces through every defense they built, because they start understanding that the person did not leave with anger, did not disappear with noise, did not create chaos or demand explanations. They simply stopped giving, stopped offering favors, stopped extending comfort, stopped providing access. And this quiet withdrawal echoes louder than any argument ever could. And viewers feel the emotional gravity of this moment like a deep exhale, because it reveals that loss does not always come from rejection. Sometimes it comes from absence, from the gradual closing of emotional doors that were once wide open. And this realization carries a unique pain because it removes the narrative of victimhood. It shows that what disappeared was not taken, it was withdrawn, and that distinction changes everything, making regret clearer, sharper, more personal, and yet still silent. And the blackout reaches its emotional peak here because the avoidant fully understands that the value they once minimized was never guaranteed, that access was a privilege, that comfort was a gift, and the audience feels a profound emotional connection at the stage because they witness truth landing softly, yet powerfully, not with devastation, but with undeniable clarity. And finally, when regret speaks with complete honesty, it does not scream or beg or demand dramatic action. It whispers with a quiet certainty that feels both gentle and heavy, a whisper that says something rare slipped away, not because it lacked importance, but because it felt safer not to need it. And this whisper changes the emotional landscape entirely because it introduces compassion into the realization, compassion for themselves, compassion for the past, compassion for the fear that once guided their choices. And viewers feel this closing stage like a soft emotional release because it does not end with despair. It ends with awareness, the understanding that regret is not always about returning. Sometimes it is about learning, about recognizing emotional value before the next opportunity arrives, about allowing vulnerability to coexist with independence rather than seeing them as enemies. And the blackout, which once felt like emptiness, transforms into insight, into emotional maturity, into a quiet promise within themselves that if warmth appears again, they will not dismiss it so quickly. And this ending resonates deeply because it shows that while the past cannot be rewritten, the future can be approached differently. And in that realization, there is a subtle hope, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, reminding viewers that even avoidant hearts, no matter how guarded, are capable of growth, reflection, and a softer understanding of connection when regret finally turns into wisdom rather than pain.